Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing daily coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Making headlines today, it would appear that the Croatian government is getting a lot of heat. That heat is coming from Ukraine, obviously, because Croatia is basically regurgitating what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is saying behind closed doors, that the likelihood that the Ukrainian military would be able to retake the Crimean Peninsula. Now, that is a stated goal by Zelensky, the current Ukrainian president, as is other leading figures inside of Ukraine as well. Again, continuing to talk about the prospects of launching a large-scale military offensive, eventually cutting the land corridor to Crimea, seizing control of Melitopol, conducting a forced crossing of the Dnieper River, while conducting major armored offensive operations south of Zaporizhia, then massing forces just north of the Crimean Peninsula and crossing via two very narrow choke points, moving into the Crimea, engaging and defeating Russian forces, and seizing control of the Crimean Peninsula. All right, let's be realistic here. The likelihood that that is going to happen is incredibly, incredibly small. It would be more likely and very, very plausible that if the Ukrainians were able to make that kind of move, and obviously they would be then fully supported by Western allies, Western European countries and the United States, then all probability we would then be in a third world war. So again, a Ukrainian seizure of the Crimean Peninsula, a successful military campaign, in all probability would bring about a third world war and quite possibly the release of battlefield nuclear weapons. So again, the likelihood that the Ukrainians would mount such a successful endeavor is ludicrous at this point. And because the Croatian government, persons in the Croatian government, stated that, they're getting a lot of heat. And that's concerning because as a nation state, Croatia, they have that right to analytically look at something that is happening in Eastern Europe, analyze what is happening, take other information that they are also getting, and then make a statement. And that statement that the Croatian government made about the unlikelihood that the Ukrainians are going to retake the Crimean Peninsula is, yes, it's probably ludicrous. Not going to happen. Do the Ukrainians have a right to the Crimean Peninsula? Now, that could be argued. And that could be argued by both sides. But I can tell you that prior to Khrushchev handing over the Crimean Peninsula to what was then essentially part of the Soviet Union, so it really didn't matter at the time that it happened, there was no separation of states. There was no Russian Federation and Ukraine. Again, they were unified under the Soviet Union. So it didn't matter. But upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, and pressure from the West and just a complete lack of funding and chaos that was going on, this occurred. I would argue that the Russians may have had more right to launch an operation to retake the Ukraine than the United States had a right to launch an operation against Iraq. Now, we can say that maybe both military operations were wrong, but at the end of the day, we are human beings. We are an inherently aggressive species. This is what we do. War has been part of humanity for as long as we have been in existence. We were fighting each other over deer carcasses and hunting grounds. And now we are fighting over more advanced issues. But nonetheless, that is just what happens. And much like the Russians lost Ukraine, the Ukrainians, again, let me back up, I misstated. Much like the Russians lost Crimea, because the Soviet Union was in chaos, the same thing happened with the Ukrainians. The Ukraine was in chaos, and the Russians stepped in and, with very little to no bloodshed, retook the Crimean Peninsula. So again, the idea that Russia is going to be militarily defeated and the Ukrainians are going to move in with Western allies into Crimea is a bit farcical. What else is going on? Well, it seems right now that the West is putting the kibosh on the prospects of the Ukrainians getting fixed-wing, multi-role aircraft. F-16's, Typhoons, Rafales, what have you. It was more likely that certain states were kicking around the prospect that the Ukrainians could receive the Typhoon, or more likely F-16's. And it looks like now that's not going to happen. Now the question is, how would that even happen? How would the Ukrainians get the F-16, deploy the F-16, and maintain the F-16? And would it make any difference? And the answer to that is simply no, it wouldn't. Right now, the Ukrainian Air Force operates very few Su-27s, Su-24s, Su-25s. They fly them incredibly low because they have to, because they'd be shot down over eastern Ukraine. So they quite literally fly these aircraft 30 meters off the ground, well below radar, nap of the earth flying. They're using, instead of using actual runways, they're using roadways to have these aircraft take off. So, look, a Russian aircraft, a Soviet-era aircraft, is a bit different than a high-performance F-16. So having an F-16 operate on roadways with infrastructure that quite possibly would always be under attack by the Russian military in the form of cruise missiles, drones, ballistic missiles, what have you. The likelihood that those F-16s would be deployed to Ukraine and would be used successfully is very doubtful. When you see the United States use its F-16s, its F-15s, it's usually flying those aircraft at altitude, and especially with air-to-ground strike missions. It's using targeting pods to analyze the battlefield, identify targets, and then attack targets, again, at altitude with these targeting pods. The Ukrainians would not be able to conduct those types of missions over eastern Ukraine. Any Ukrainian F-16 flying at 15,000 to 40,000 feet would be shot down by Russian S-400s, S-300s, and even Russian aircraft as well. But more importantly, it's the Russian air defense systems that would really negate the ability of the Ukrainians to deploy these F-16s. Now, could they toss small diameter bombs at distance, GPS-guided SMBs, small diameter bombs? Sure, they could, possibly. But again, ultimately, the Russians would start to target those locales where those F-16s were taking off from. So it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to maintain those F-16s effectively. Again, just because the Ukrainians would receive high-performance advanced aircraft, that does not equate to immediate success and some sort of air dominance. Now, look, if there was some sort of pause in the fighting and Ukraine was then rearmed under somewhat peaceful conditions with F-16s, now that would be a little different. But in the middle of the war, for the Ukrainians to receive F-16s and then deploy those F-16s from Ukrainian airspace, Ukrainian roadways, Ukrainian air bases, that's going to become incredibly difficult. And again, how effective would it be? And in the end, you would probably see some of those F-16s being destroyed on the ground or shot down in the air. And the rest really doesn't want to see that happen. The United States doesn't. Lockheed Martin certainly does not. But that's the sort of situation those F-16s would be placed into. Now, could they operate from Polish airspace? But then we're, again, back to World War III again. I don't believe the Russians would be okay with Ukrainian F-16s taking off from Polish air bases and attacking Russian targets. Again, then the Russians would have every right to launch attacks against targets in Poland. And again, there we are, World War III. So I hope that gives a bit of an explanation on the whole F-16 discussion and why it, all probability, would not help things, would not make things any better, would not change the dynamics on the battlefield. And then again, the idea that the Ukrainians are going to retake the Crimean Peninsula. And because Croatia, again, has taken issue with that, as have a lot of other NATO states behind closed doors. But it's not politically correct to say that. You cannot come out and say in the current political climate and say, well, you know what, Ukraine, you're not getting Crimea back. Hey, Ukraine, you're not getting Crimea back. I said it. So we'll see if I get canceled. Have a good day, everybody.